Today we are talking to Doug Oman, an adjunct professor at Berkeley Public Health. He's the editor of the book Why Religion and Spirituality Matter for Public Health, which came out in 2018, and is the former director of the traineeship on spirituality and public health at the University of California, Berkeley. Today, Doug is going to talk about the benefits of simply repeating a short phrase over and over. Welcome, Doug. Would you like to give our listeners a brief description of what these short phrases are?
Okay, yeah. The ones I'll be talking about are often called mantras if they're drawn from Eastern traditions, or they may be called holy names or prayer words drawn from Western traditions. There is good reason to believe there are a lot of similar processes involved, and people use them in diverse ways. You can use them as part of a sitting meditation practice, for example, focusing your attention on repeating a mantra, repeating a holy name, or they can be used more portably, so to speak.
And you can say it sort of out loud or internally, right?
Yes. There is a strong tradition of doing chanting, but in the people who are leading lives in the modern world, a lot of times they'll want to just repeat it silently. And that also has a very long tradition of just silent repetition, either as part of a sitting practice or portably. One can be walking down the street, silently repeating. One can be waiting in line at a grocery store, silently repeating a holy name or a mantra rather than browsing the whatever the tabloids are telling you as you're waiting in line at the checkout stand.
Yeah, tell me more about this portable mantra practice.
That's it's a way to integrate it into one's often very busy daily life. We've published articles describing ways that, for example, health professionals, if you're a physician or other health professional, if you're walking around meeting with lots of people, patients, colleagues, you may have a very busy day, you may have many stresses that you're dealing with, but you can find little ways to work it into your routine. And each time you manage to work it in, it can be a sort of a calming and rebalancing, strengthening influence. You can repeat it while you're walking down a hallway rather than ruminating about whatever stressor has come to you. You can give yourself a little cue routine to where each time before you open the door to meet a new patient, you can remind yourself to say it 3 times before you touch the doorknob, and or various other little ways one can integrate it in, and maintain a more centered day for yourself in that way. Yeah,
that's great. So you mentioned that Eastern cultures have them. You want to tell us about how widespread this is across traditional cultures?
It seems to be very widespread across all the major religious and spiritual traditions. I don't think every denomination, so to speak, would have it, but there are mantras in many mantras in Buddhism. A very famous Tibetan mantra is Om Mani Padme Hum, which means the jewel in the lotus, often interpreted as the jewel in the lotus of the heart, that there is a deeper source of strength that can be drawn on through repeating this phrase. There are Christian mantras such as the Ave Maria, Christian holy names, or the name of Jesus, or the famous Jesus prayer from Eastern Orthodox Christianity. In Hinduism, Mahatma Gandhi used the mantra Rama, which one of the translations of that is simply joy, calling on one's deepest, most joyful and strongest self.
That's a lot. So I mean, you mentioned earlier that you reserved the term mantra for Eastern, but like, do we consider these more Western religion phrases also mantra?
Yes, that's the way it has been emerging in some of the literature, both some of the spiritual literature and some of the research literature. So that's the way I use the term, as something from a tradition that has been used as a repeated invocation within a spiritual tradition. That's the way I use the term. Though, as is often the case, the people one is talking about as a scientist or researcher may have their own preferred term. So I think in Western traditions, mostly they would prefer to call it by something like holy name or prayer word, maybe. There are quite a number of different phrases that get used, and I'm sure they'll keep evolving too.
Right, because the term mantra is where did that come from?
That comes from Indian tradition, I guess Hinduism. I think it's also deep in Buddhism and Jainism, other non-Hindu Indian traditions. But basically, anyway, it goes way back in Indian tradition. It's a Sanskrit word.
Yeah. Okay. Now I was most familiar with mantras in terms of something called mantra meditation, where you're repeating the phrase and basically doing nothing else for a period of time. Would you talk to me a little bit about mantra meditation and maybe how it's similar and different from other kinds of meditation that people might be familiar with?
Yeah. Transcendental meditation, which was how meditation burst on the consciousness of much of the Western public back in the 1960s when the Beatles started doing transcendental meditation. That is a form of mantra meditation. They don't disclose their mantras. One is supposed to keep one's mantra a secret, though there have been disaffected former TM meditators who've let on. But they do use lots of mantras from Indian traditions. They don't. Their mode is they don't generally explain what they mean to people. To most beginning TM meditators, but lots and lots of people have found that even without knowing exactly what the phrases may have meant in Sanskrit, that they're strengthening, they're calming, soothing, empowering. So there are enormous numbers of people continuing to do TM, but there are also other forms of mantra meditation. I think in the West, the hesychasm, repetition of the Jesus prayer in Eastern Orthodox tradition is one could call that a form of mantra meditation because one is usually concentrating on that single phrase. There are some nuances in these different methods about exactly how one handles one's attention. Like if one is losing attention to the phrase itself, but there's no other distraction coming in, then is that okay, or should one seek to keep the phrase repeating as strongly as possible? There are different methods, have slightly different ways of handling that type of situation, but I think all of those get described as mantra meditation.
Is it a kind of a focus meditation, kind of like focusing on your breathing, but instead of your breath, you're focusing?
It's very often classified that way. Yeah, I would say unless you're using quite a refined way of classifying, I would say it's a type of focus meditation. In fact, that type of meditation is also taught or advocated as part of the traditional Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, meditating on the word Om, which that too would be a classic form of mantra meditation. Yeah.
Right. And you had a paper just come out in American Psychologist, which I thought was great, an overview of the research on this. And this is a science-based podcast addressing, this is a topic that's a traditional spiritual, traditionally non-scientific area that is being studied by science. So I really appreciated that article. Can you tell us a little bit about why anyone would do mantras? Like, what is the evidence of its benefits, and what are those benefits?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there have been, if you pool together all the different methods that have been studied, there's, enormous body of research on TM, of varying quality. Not every study was of highest quality, but and then there have also been, in the last 20 years or so, increasing numbers of studies of portable mantra or holy name prayer word repetition. Pool all these together, you see many of the things you want from stress management. You see things like reduced depression, reduced anxiety, reduced sense of distress. It's been used in, these methods have been used in treating post-traumatic stress disorder, people getting more self-efficacy for managing symptoms. Mindfulness itself has started to become thought of as a beneficial health quality, and that interestingly does seem to be supported. There's a reasonable number of studies now that show that having a mantra practice, even if one isn't doing one of the so-called mindfulness-based interventions now, like the mindfulness-based stress reduction, that doing these mantra practices also fosters mindfulness as a trait, or as a disposition, you could say. And one could think of mantra repetition as a mindfulness practice. There's evidence for that now. Positive coping, mantra repetition supports more positive ways of coping with stress, spiritual well-being, quite a number of randomized trials, many, quasi-experiments, lots of observational correlational studies or pre-post tests. Yes, quite a solid body of evidence. Maybe not testing efficacy in every last little, every last subgroup. There's obviously more work to be done. Certainly, there are issues around wanting people to have the right fit with methods that work with them. So, issues of cultural adaptation still need more work. But overall, there's very clear evidence that there's benefit. And one of the things that in this recent paper that I tried to bring out was that there is added value from using a spiritual a mantra derived from a spiritual tradition. In fact, that's the way the scientific literature has been using the phrase up until a couple of years ago. And that's part of what catalyzed my paper, was to say, we've been using this phrase, to the term mantra, to refer to something drawn from a spiritual tradition. We've been using it this way for 50 years. There's cogent reason to keep it with that meaning. And I described a bunch of those reasons. Is that the mantra can make more available, more psychologically available, for purposes of comfort, but also for purposes of drawing on coping resources, the resources of spiritual and religious traditions.
Yeah.
I could go into that. The paper goes into some of those, what some of those resources may be, which I think are not always a matter of familiarity for psychologists or other researchers, because they're not the field of. You mentioned my book at the outset. There is now a huge body of research, thousands of empirical studies, hundreds of systematic reviews, dozens of meta-analyses of spirituality and religion as health factors, but they're spread across many different disciplines. So many scientists just may not be aware of the breadth of this and depth, and strength of this research base, just because maybe some particular journal, their journals in their field may only occasionally cover it. So but there is now this enormous base. So that's part of why it's useful to keep the term mantra referring to something from a spiritual tradition.
Right. I just read a great book by James Nestor called Breath, and he talks about the research showing that the optimal inhale length and exhale length is about 5.5 seconds. And he noted that a lot of traditional mantras took about that long to say. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, he's not a scientist, but it was an intriguing idea. I don't know if you had any thoughts about the length of the mantra and how much that matters. I know there's something called passage meditation, which is like a longer version. Any thoughts about the length of mantras?
Yeah. That sounds about right to me, that many of the traditional mantras are about that length. But there are some that are shorter, like Mahatma Gandhi's Mantram Rama. I don't think it would take 5 seconds to say that.
And Om takes half that time.
Right, yeah. Right, yeah. Yeah, you can get it down to 1 syllable, yeah. And then there are others that are longer, like the people who I think call themselves maybe Bhakti Vedanta, but that are widely known as the Hare Krishnas. Mm-hmm. They use a phrase, a longer mantra that I'm not even sure, maybe 20, 25 syllables. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. So that's longer than 5.5 seconds. So I think it does vary somewhat. But maybe that's not a coincidence that often they're of approximately that length. I think traditions do vary considerably in whether they advise one to try to synchronize with the breath, or to let the breath do its own thing and keep the mind on the mantra as one's repeating. So those are interesting topics, but again, there's diversity, so that it's hard to generalize. I think one consideration that I would have is that in the modern world, conditions may be a little different than the conditions in which most mantras were originated, where most people would have been exposed to largely the natural world. In the modern world, we're around so many machines, and we're constantly coming in contact with so many stimuli that that we've lost some of the stabilizing influence from being around, being more in contact with nature. So that I think the breath, there may be things that can happen if one synchronizes the breath with different things that may be different than in traditional settings. So so I think there it's maybe anyway. That's one of the considerations that I think comes in the advice that gets given in different traditions. So it's very interesting that mantras do seem to match that length.
I have a spiritual teacher who recently taught me a mantra, and like you said earlier, I'm not allowed to repeat it. I'm not allowed to tell anyone. He's only taught 2 other people, but it is, I think, about 21 syllables of Indonesian, and I don't know what it means. And it was a struggle to even memorize it. But yes, it's quite long, and I'm getting faster at it now. So I've been trying to do it for about 5 days, but at first, it took a very long time. Yeah, it's interesting, but I am still trying to coordinate it with my breath. Also in this breath book, they talk about other breathing exercises where you try to extend your exhale to 30 seconds. So, that's, so, kind of whatever your mantra length is, it's, you can, work with breath work and controlling your breath, which has a lot of relaxation benefits and that kind of thing.
I think some mantras that are longer, they speak of having a kernel part of a mantra, like that longer Hare Krishna, Hare Rama mantra. Sometimes just Hare Krishna, I think, is sometimes thought of as a kernel of that. And similarly, like the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy. I think maybe the kernel of that one could think of as just the word Jesus. So if one's working on integrating that into one's day, then if one's walking 3 blocks down the street, one could say the fuller mantra. But if you're in the midst of a party and you're being you only have a brief period to center yourself, so to speak, then maybe you'd want to use the kernel, so to speak.
So why does it work? What are the explanations out there in the scientific literature about the causal mechanism of why mantra repetition has these benefits?
Well, I think some of them may pertain to the effects on attention of bringing one's mind back to a particular familiar object over and over again, or just the very effort of bringing one's attention back can help foster concentration. So the particular suite of processes that would be active would depend upon the details of one's practice, whether you were doing it portably or as part of sitting meditation or some combination of those. But then the part where it comes from spiritual tradition, where there's a difference maybe between having a mantra from a spiritual tradition versus just any phrase like, I don't know, the word one, which was recommended by Herbert Benson as part of a secularized sitting meditation. If you've drawn on something from a spiritual tradition, then it may activate all the resources in the spiritual tradition, or either activate them or make them more accessible to you. It may make it easier for you to look at life through a spiritual lens, so to speak, which often will mean things like looking at life through a lens of compassion, so to speak, of being compassionate, so that maybe if somebody comes up and asks you a rude question or seems to have a rude premise for their question, maybe if you just pause 3 seconds to repeat your mantra, your mantra kernel a couple of times, then maybe that can just tilt your mind somewhat so that you're more able to respond compassionately to that person. So that might be one benefit of looking at life through a spiritual lens. Another might be that spiritual traditions usually hold out for people spiritual goals, spiritual strivings of trying to be compassionate, of maybe of trying to be of service to God's children, so to speak, and so that then if one has those spiritual strivings, so to speak, that's one way it gets talked about scientifically. If those spiritual strivings are more mentally available, maybe if you're just at a little juncture where maybe you'd think, oh boy, I'm feeling kind of stressed out, maybe you'll go take a fourth drink of that punch with all that vodka in it, but instead of that, you think, well, I'm feeling kind of stressed, but maybe if I just engage myself in that spiritual striving, that would be engaging and that would get me in a good place. So that, anyway, there are a number of different processes that could be at work. And yeah.
Yeah, and I was reading some of the papers you cited, and another one I read was had to do with the fact that a lot of people's unwanted, stressful thoughts are verbal in nature. And so people differ in this. Some people just have a constant, often negative chatter in their heads that they can't silence. And I'm not like that. I'm about a quarter of my thoughts are verbal, a lot of conceptual and visual stuff. But in cognitive science, there's pretty good evidence suggesting that your mind can only generate one stream of speech at a time, right? So if you're occupying that mechanism in your mind with a mantra, it effectively silences the chatter, which is like plagues a lot of people. So I thought that was another interesting explanation.
In fact, there's an image that gets used in the spiritual tradition that the mind can be like an elephant. And if you're riding this elephant, I guess this is a problem that comes up in traditional Asian societies where there are elephants, that you're marching along and you pass a roadside vendor who's selling fruits, and the elephant's trunk just swoops over and scoops up some of those fruits. But if you take a staff and you give the elephant a staff, apparently this is what the mahouts do, that then by holding the staff, its trunk gets occupied so that it doesn't get into all this trouble. So the same way, you can occupy your mind with a mantra rather than having it go off and ruminate about all kinds of all kinds of things. Yeah.
So one thing I read about the benefit of a mantra practice is that over the years, the mantra will sort of be running in the background continually, almost like a song stuck in your head. And that it makes it very easy to, if you encounter a distressing situation, it's easy to just simply focus on this sort of sound in your head or these words in your head. And you don't have to even like generate it. It's sort of there in the background. Have you heard anything like this? Is in your experience, is this how it works?
I haven't attained that state, so to speak.
You have?
No, I haven't.
You have not? Oh, okay.
But I've known people who've reported it, and in one technical term for that in Indian tradition is a japa japam. One way that the repetition of the mantram is referred to in Indian tradition is japa, and so a japa japa is mantram repetition without doing mantram repetition. It's like just as you say, it's going in the background, and in Western tradition, Saint Paul advised people to pray without ceasing, and there's a wonderful book called A Way of a Pilgrim, which is attributed to a anonymous Russian pilgrim in the 19th century who reports that he heard the advice to pray without ceasing one day in church, and he went to maybe it was the priest or something, and asked, well, how do I do this? And that, in Russian tradition, that would be called the starets, gave him the Jesus prayer, and told him to repeat that a certain number of times. Maybe it was 1,000 times or something. Anyway, this book then describes how he followed those instructions, and gradually, over time, it did start repeating itself in his mind, and so he attained that same state. And then it can be like a duet that you can join.
Right.
If you're walking along the beach and there aren't particular stressors you're encountering, then you can join in the chorus. Your conscious mind can join with your unconscious mind in the chorus. But if you do encounter turbulence, so to speak, then often the mantra, the holy name, may tug at your sleeve, so to speak, saying, "Okay, now remember to look at life through a compassionate view. Don't get too embroiled in don't get too worked up about this. Remember that this too will pass. So try to respond to it anyway." So yeah. I hope it happens to you soon.
Yeah, well, so I mean, it's interesting that the mantra I was taught, I don't know the meaning of it, but how? And I'm not a member of the culture, the Indonesian culture, that finds this to be a sacred saying either. How important is it that the mantra itself be personally meaningful or sacred to the person who is practicing it? How important is that for its benefits?
I think that's another thing that does depend on your tradition, whatever you've drawn it from. Because in TM, I don't think that's ever made much of a priority for at least most of the
Just a
people
reminder, listeners,
who do
TM is transcendental meditation.
Right, yes, transcendental, yes. Whereas others, so the people who developed the portable mantra meditation that has gotten quite a bit of scientific study through Jill Bormann of Veterans Administration and University of San Diego. In that method, it is desirable that one knows what one's mantra means, what one's holy name means. I think there can be validity to both methods. One, I think also over time, one can learn more about what a mantra means. Like maybe at some point you'll be learning more, and that will be a source of inspiration for you. Like, just as, say, a science student, you've heard about E equals MC squared from an early age, probably. But I actually, when I was studying physics I took an AP physics course in high school, and actually started applying the thing. So it to the problems from the textbook. So it meant something. And I think a more common experience is more people study calculus, maybe dy dx. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, if you study calculus, and there are more things to learn. Like maybe you just learn it as a meaningless formula, but maybe after a while you realize, oh well, the dy is an infinitesimal and the dx is another infinitesimal. So maybe here, instead of learning about infinitesimals, we're learning about symbols of infinity. So
yeah. So tell me, have you got a mantra practice yourself? And would you tell us, if you do, what some of your experiences were with it?
Yes, I do. I got it actually as part of a practice called passage meditation, which I learned early on, which you mentioned briefly earlier. That is a little bit unusual in that there is a sitting practice involved, and there's also a portable mantra repetition practice involved. And those are different because a lot of times they'll tell you to do out portably whatever you may be doing in your sitting practice. But in this, we use longer memorized passages, like, say, the full 23rd Psalm,
Okay.
or lengthy passages from other scriptures, from the Bhagavad Gita, or from the Buddhist Dhammapada, or anyway, we use those lengthy passages during a sitting practice. One can, go through much of the Sermon on the Mount, maybe 2 or 3 times in a half an hour, and drive those home as a source of, drive them deeper into one's consciousness as a source of inspiration. But then we have a separate passage, we have a separate, shorter phrase that we use as a mantra for the portable practice. That's what I do. I had been, when I started this, I was regularly attending a Roman Catholic church, so I ended up choosing a Roman Catholic mantra, Roman Catholic holy name to repeat. So that's what I do when I'm out and about, walking down the street or waiting in a line, or just little breaks. That's what I do. I repeat that mantra, and yeah. And I haven't it hasn't gotten to the point of being a default thing that rises whenever I stop concentrating on something. But sometimes I can tell that it's gotten deep in there. Sometimes I've had the experience of stubbing my toe, and instead of cussing, I'll take refuge in the mantram as a source of strength and comfort, which also takes my mind away from from the pain. And yeah, if one needs to undergo a painful medical procedure, rather than wondering, oh, I wonder how painful this is going to be. Well, let's see. Is that is the needle in my arm yet, or what? Instead of that, one can just turn one's mind right to the mantra.
Yeah. Well, good. Okay. So what about the future? What kind of things would you like to see, the directions you'd like to see the field go in, and what are some of the next questions that should be addressed by the scientific study of mantra?
Well, you're inciting my public health, inciting me to put on my public health hat, so to speak.
Okay.
Because I think most or maybe all of the mantra studies to date have been mostly from the standpoint of psychology and other individual, clinically focused professions.
Okay.
But particularly mantra, because it's so interdisciplinary, inclusive, and if people say, well, I don't want anything from any spiritual tradition at all, well, they can substitute a non-spiritual phrase. I wouldn't call it a mantra, but they could essentially do the practice only using a mantra-like phrase instead of an actual, what I would call a mantra. I think those could be beneficially made more widely available in a way that is culturally sensitive, legally sensitive, and so on. We've seen mindfulness in school, mindfulness-based stress reduction in lots of schools and lots of workplaces. I think, sometimes there's controversy about whether that's really secular or whether it's stealth Buddhism. or something like that that's proselytizing. I think one can understand why there's concerns on both sides. I think there's something mantra practice, holy name repetition, whatever, repetition of a single phrase is something that's so simple and almost transparent that it can be very easily made to be interfaith inclusive, culturally inclusive. But I think it would be great to have that made available more widely to people in inappropriate ways, in schools, in wherever one has done public health interventions,
Right.
too, which is across a lot of different, workplaces, things like that. I think there's potential for that.
So if a listener wanted to get started, would you recommend that there's a book they would read, or what would you recommend that they do?
Well, let's see. Yeah, I have some particular favorite books and so on. One place that they could start, since I've been wearing the scientific hat for most of the time here, is we had a paper come out in the journal Mindfulness. It's open access. I was the third author. The first author was Jill Bormann, who's done most of the work on portable mantra repetition, and I can send you a link or whatever. And that gets people started. It even has lists of widely used mantras from different traditions.
Mm-hmm.
That would be one way to start. My own practice was developed by a fellow named Easwaran, a spiritual teacher from India, who came to this country first in 1959, and he passed away in 1999. And he developed the passage meditation method, and I think gives one of maybe the fullest exposition, I guess you could say, of portable mantra repetition. So if you want to start out with the portable mantra repetition, I would say that's a very good place to start.
His book, Meditation, was the first meditation book I ever read back in the 90s, recommended to me by a psych professor. So, okay, great. Well, we'll send me a link to that. We'll put it in our show notes, and people can look at it. So we encourage people to explore this if it sounds intriguing. And thank you so much for coming on. We've been talking to Doug Oman about mantras, and thanks for coming. It was a real pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you all for listening.